Welcome to this presentation on pluralism and theology, particularly on Rahner's idea of the anonymous Christian. And remember, there are a number of views, plural, many views, stretching between two poles. On the one side, we have the naive realism of the inerrantists, who are dogmatic in their insistence on key doctrines remaining unchanged over time and emanating from an infallible Bible. And on the other pole, the critical realists, the liberals, the universalists, such as John Hick, who tend to appeal to the divine reality that underpins all things and every religion. And Karl Rahner, has four theses in his writing. The first is that exclusive salvation remains in Jesus Christ. He says, Christianity understands itself as the absolute religion intended for all men, which cannot recognize any other religion beside itself as of equal right. Why? He says, because it rests on this unique revelation of the one word of God become flesh. John chapter 1, the word became flesh and dwelt among us. Second thesis is that any religion can mediate the divine reality of God. A non-Christian religion does not merely contain elements of a natural knowledge of God, mixed up, however, he goes on to qualify this, with human depravity. It contains also supernatural elements arising out of the grace of God. For this reason, a non-Christian religion can be recognized as a lawful religion without thereby denying the error and depravity contained within it. So, any religion can mediate God, says Rahner, but it will do so imperfectly. The third thesis is that anyone who is not a Christian can therefore be an anonymous Christian. The non-Christian may be already someone on the way towards his or her salvation, and someone who in certain circumstances finds it without being reached by the proclamation of the church's message. And if it is at the same time true that this salvation is Christ's salvation and there is no other salvation, then it must be possible to be not only an anonymous theist, but also an anonymous Christian. That is, a person who is seeking God, who has not heard the proclamation, the gospel of the Christian church, is seeking God and on the way, as it were, to this unique path, or on this unique path, this one bridge of salvation. And the fourth thesis is the vanguard church. The church will not so much regard herself today as the exclusive community of those who have a claim to salvation, but rather as the historically tangible vanguard. So, the church, according to Rahner, expresses in history what the divine reality really represents. The church still bears witness to this one way, the Word of God made flesh, the unique revelation. So we have four words: mediation, anonymity, vanguard, and exclusivism. Spelling the acronym MAVE. So let's just compare Rahner and Hick very briefly. The emphasis in Rahner is of the final expression of God's salvation plan through Christ, his incarnation, his death, his resurrection, those important doctrines of the church. Whereas Hick has shifted the emphasis to the eternal divine reality which exists in Kant's unknowable noumenal realm. For other religions, Rahner believes that they have elements of insight, but also they are still degraded, in a sense, by depravity. Whereas Hick is more positive. He says they all show forth elements of divinity. One wonders where Hick draws the line, though. Does he include animist faiths that see God inhabiting trees and plants, for example? What about members of other religions? They are seekers after truth and can in principle be anonymous Christians, says Rahner. They are seekers after truth, searching for the divine reality, the analogy of the sun, casting its light on every planet, not just on the earth, says Hick. As far as the Son of God is concerned, Jesus was unique Son of God, says Rahner, attested by miracles and prophecies fulfilled. But Hick sees the incarnation as a metaphor and a myth, meaning that Jesus behaved as Son of God in a godly way. Jesus was not actually divine and never said he was. He preferred the title that you find in St. Mark's Gospel, Son of Man, rather than Son of God. The church, to Rahner, is the visible symbol of God's presence, although God can be present elsewhere, whereas to Hick, the church is not the sole source of salvation and has no privileged position as guardian of truth, is not the guardian of the absolute. For Rahner, Christianity remains superior and absolute in that sense. But the history before Christ suggests that God can be active in many ways and indeed continues to be so. One of many ways, says Hick, to God, Christianity, none inherently superior. So much more modest claim by Hick. We have, say the pluralists, certain empirical facts on our side. People seem to be inherently religious. The observation there is substantial diversity in faith is true, of course, and also in the actual content, the beliefs themselves. But if you're Hick, you believe you're still grasping at one divine reality. There is the assumption that religious belief is not an illusion, that there is a divine reality, even though it's hard to access, as in Kant's idea of the noumenal. And there is the assumption that almost every religious tradition positively changes its followers' lives. Very hard to prove, and of course, Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion argues precisely the opposite, that religions generally have had negative effects, although sometimes he would concede positive effects on believers. Exclusivism, then, has what to some of us are unacceptable implications. Says Hick, to put it graphically, consider the analogy of the solar system with God as the sun at the centre, the religions as the planet circling around that centre. Inclusivism then holds the life-giving warmth and light of the sun falls directly only on the earth. The Christian church is then reflective of it in lesser degrees to other planets, to other religions. So to conclude, Christianity has always been pluralistic. For example, Montanism that we encounter in Gender and Theology is a heresy of the 2nd century that was suppressed, but it had women leaders and women prophets. Pluralism, secondly, stretches between these two poles, Gensler, inerrancy, exclusivism, and Hick, pluralism, inclusivism. Redemptoris missio echoes Rahner's idea of the anonymous Christian and seems to sit between these two poles, claiming one salvation through Christ, but many paths by which God's grace can operate in the world, a kind of inclusive exclusivism.